Okay, Chapter 2, Beginnings of English America. Now, in the lecture video for Chapter 1, we covered the colonization of the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch. So this time in Chapter 2, we're focusing specifically on English colonization in North America. But before we get to North America, we're going to talk a little bit about English colonization in Ireland because there are some parallels. So first off, at this point, as we're getting to the late 1500s and early 1600s, it's primarily the time period that we're focusing on. By this time, England is a Protestant country, not a Catholic country, right? Both are considered Christians, but different sects of Christianity. Okay. And so while England is Protestant, Ireland is still Catholic, right? The people of Ireland have not broken away from the Catholic Church at this point. Still haven't. So the English began to colonize Ireland, and they would surprisingly bring up a number of stereotypes about the Irish that you would later see them using against Native Americans, right? Similar types of stereotypes. The English at the time considered the Irish to be barbaric. They would call them the quote unquote wild Irish. And this is similar to how Native Americans were portrayed as being barbaric, that stereotype that we had discussed in Chapter One's lecture video, right? And so you start to see this kind of depiction of the people whose land is being colonized by the English, right? They're always being depicted as barbaric, whereas the English are portraying themselves as being the civilized ones. Okay. Yet at this time, they're the ones who are colonizing the lands of others. And when the English would colonize Ireland, they would set up whole communities, and these communities would be known as plantations, not because they were growing crops. No, what they meant by plantations at this time was they were planting communities, they were planting settlers, they were planting themselves in a foreign land, okay? A land that was occupied by other peoples. And similar to North America, the English would not really integrate the peoples whose land they were colonizing, right? So, and then the English called their communities, the early settlements and communities in North America, plantations as well. So, both in Ireland and North America, these colonies were called plantations, where they were planting their people there. And so, yes, the English did not incorporate people that were not English into these plantations, right? So they kept the Irish people separate from them. Okay, they didn't include them in their communities, and the same thing would be done with Native Americans in North America. Native Americans did not often intermarry with English settlers, and there was trade, of course, that went on between the two groups, but not living amongst each other within the same settlement, right? The English like to keep their settlements separate, right? They created their own social order, right, in a foreign land, these plantations, right? So you see some similarities between English colonization in Ireland and English colonization in North America. Brutality would be another similarity that you see in both areas, where the English would use violence at times. That's one of their methods of colonization, using violence against the people of the land that they're trying to colonize, right? And some of that violence would be chopping off the heads or cutting off the heads of either Irish or Native Americans, and posting them publicly, like on poles, all right, right, like up high to where people could see them. And this was a tactic of intimidation. Um, in modern day times, we would call this terrorism because it's trying to strike terror into the hearts of this population so that they could control them. and the population would be less likely to resist their colonization efforts. Okay. So now, as we get to North America, we see the English starting or at least trying to start to set up colonies in North America. And keep in mind, at this time, late 1500s, going into the early 1600s, the English are not a major world empire or a major world power at that time. They're a minor world power. And at that time, as far as European empires go, Spain was the most powerful European empire at that time. Okay. And so England is trying to get in on the colonization of North America. And so some of the early charters that were given out, and what is a charter? A charter is basically the right to start a colony. And so, in this sense, charters could also be used in terms of companies and corporations, but in this particular case, we're talking about charters being given to individuals or to companies by the English crown. And those charters are basically giving the rights of these individuals or companies, in some cases, to start their own colonies in North America. Okay, so some of the early charters that were given to English individuals were the charter given to Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Sir Walter Raleigh. And so Sir Humphrey Gilbert, he was actually an experienced colonizer. He was known for his brutality involved in the colonization of Ireland. And he was in the late 1500s given a charter to colonize North America. And he actually attempted to start a colony in Newfoundland, but that colony ultimately failed pretty quickly because of poor planning. Now, in the case of Sir Walter Raleigh, Raleigh attempted to set up colonies and did set up colonies. They were unsuccessful ultimately, but he did set up colonies in the area around modern-day Virginia and the Carolinas, around that area. And these early colonies ultimately failed. And one in particular, the colony on Roanoke Island, is a famous English colony. The reason why it's famous is because no one knows what happened to the colonists. When Sir Walter Raleigh's men, like ships, coming from England, came with supplies to bring supplies to the colonists, no one was there. They had all disappeared, and there was, a big mystery. Oh, what happened to them? What happened to them? And it's a little ominous because on a tree where the colony was, something was written. The colonists had carved something into the tree, and they carved the word Croatoan. And so Croatoan, no one knew what that meant really. What is that the name of a tribe? Was that the name of a village, a Native American village nearby? Did they go to that village? What happened? Were the colonists all killed off? Did they just simply migrate and live with the Native American tribe in a village nearby? For a long time, it was a big mystery. No one knew what happened to them. More recently, evidence has come about that it's most likely that the colony that was on Roanoke Island actually did uh, move from Roanoke Island to a Native American village where they continued to live for several generations. And the reason why we believe this today is because of evidence being found, English items from that time period being found in an area that was a former Native American village. And so it's most likely that the colonists from Roanoke Island actually did just leave and were not murdered by, some tribe. And so these are some of the early examples of English colonization in North America. And both of these examples were failures, right? But we'll eventually get to more successful colonies that the English had in North America. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the reasons why the English wanted to colonize North America. Number one, brought this up a little bit earlier, talking about the Spanish Empire being the most powerful European empire in the world. I'm saying European empire because there were other powerful empires that were not European at that same time. Um, so Spain was dominating in terms of colonies in North America, right? Spanish America, the colonies were massive, huge in Central America and South America, and a little bit in parts of North America as well, right around modern day Florida, um, and also New Mexico. Now, the English, like I said, wanted to get in on this game, and so they were rivals. They wanted to consider themselves rivals to the Spanish Empire. There were, a number of these European empires that were rivaling each other at that time, the French, the Dutch, and the English, all trying to catch up with Spain, all trying to establish colonies in North America. Okay. And so that's one of the reasons. And we talked before about the Black Legend, which was, this portrayal of Spanish colonization being inhumane and brutal, and their rivals would promote the Black Legend. And, there's, of course, truth to the Black Legend. We don't want to say that it was completely false, but it would definitely be emphasized by other European nations, like England, who basically felt that they could create more humane colonies in North America. And so that was one of the reasons why the British wanted to get involved in colonization. And of course, when they come to colonize, the first thing they're looking for is gold and precious minerals, right? Gold and silver, because that's, instant wealth, of course. That's one thing that they'll be looking for. But eventually they decide another route, and we'll talk about that a little later on how they're going to make money off of their colonies. But another one of the professed goals of the British in North America is to spread Protestantism, okay, as opposed to spreading Catholicism like the Spanish were involved in. And so this goes back to the Reformation, where you have a number of different European countries and principalities who are breaking away from the Catholic Church, and also by breaking away from the Catholic Church, kind of breaking away in some cases from the influence of Spain. And so you had this major religious rivalry going on in Europe and abroad in the colonies, Catholic versus Protestant, right? And so the English wanted to spread Protestantism as opposed to Catholicism in their colonies. And you would read, if you're reading some of the English publications at that time, those that were talking about colonization, some would go on to spread propaganda, saying that, the Indians would happily accept English colonization as opposed to the brutal Spanish colonization, and that Indians would be liberated and they'd be excited to see the English coming and they would welcome them with open arms and be screaming liberty, 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 and all this stuff, Um, and so that's how the English envisioned the welcoming coming from Native Americans in relation to English colonization. Okay. And yes, I mean, we've seen many modern wars, that the United States has been involved in, where you hear a similar type of rhetoric, where the people that are where the war is going to take place are going to be so happy and be screaming for liberty when the Americans arrive, but then instead you have a prolonged war. Um, okay, so some other reasons why the British wanted to colonize North America. One, they had a growing population. Okay. In a 50 years time span, the population of England grew by 1 million people, from 3 million to 4 million. Okay. And that's a massive leap in a short period of time. And, England, it's an island, there's limited resources. And so, with this big population, that's going to be an issue. And that is further exasperated by something called the enclosure movement. What's the enclosure movement? Um, in England, you have the manorial system, formerly known as the feudal system. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that before. But what you have with the feudal system is basically a lord, right, who owns the property, owns the land, and then you have peasants who live on the land of the Lord and work for the Lord. And when I say Lord, we're talking about, a member of the English gentry, wealthy landowner, prominent family. Um, and they work for the Lord. The Lord has a lot of control over them, not just as an employer, but also as like like this the rule of law, right? And so these lords had massive control over the lives of the peasants who worked for them and lived on their land. And so for a long time in several hundred years, um, in England, you had that type of social structure, right? This manorial or feudal social structure. But as we start to get into the late 1500s, you start to see the enclosure movement taking off. And what that is these lords, these wealthy landowners, they started to switch from not focus, switch from their focus of farming to focusing on herding sheep or raising sheep for their wool. And so as they started to switch towards raising sheep, they didn't need the labor of all of these peasants on their land anymore. It didn't take a bunch of peasants to raise sheep, right? All you need is a couple sheep herders, right? And so they started closing off their land, fencing it off and kicking out the peasants who used to live there. And the place where they used to have fields, now they're raising sheep there. This is the enclosure movement, right? They're enclosing off their land, and now they're making a lot of money off of growing and raising sheep. And what are they doing with that wool? Well, the wool is going to be used for the textile industry. Okay. So the textile industry is like for clothing or cloth. And so a lot of money in that. All right, so that's why they're making that change. But this is going to have a big impact on the lives of the English peasantry. Now they have nowhere to live. Where are they going to go? They're going to the cities. They're not in the countryside anymore now. Many of them are being kicked off the countryside or out of the countryside and are going to the cities. And so this leads to a social crisis because now the populations of the cities are growing, right, at a very fast rate, and there's not enough jobs for all of these people. So you have a lot of people that are living in poverty that are going around looking for jobs, but there's no jobs to be had, right? And so this is a social crisis. And so one of the solutions for this social crisis was to have these peasants who are now in the cities migrate, right, to other English colonies around the world, and one of those colonies being in North America, or some of those colonies being in North America, right? And so you have English writers, part of the educated class writing about this, like, hey, this is a good solution. We could put these people to work. They can go over to North America, for example, and work on farms there and grow, natural resources. Those natural resources could be used here in England. We could take our products that we manufacture in England and sell them to the colonists over there in those colonies and make a profit off of that, right? Because they're going to need goods. And so migration becomes a solution for this social crisis of overpopulation, right, in England. All right, so many of these impoverished people, though, cannot afford that that trip, that boat ride, all the way over to North America. It costs about 1 year's salary, right, for most workers, right? And people are not able to save up 1 year's salary to pay for that for that trip over to North America to be a colonist. And so, what do you do? How are you going to get these people over there if they can't pay for it? Well, you have them sign an indenture, right? You have them agree to an indenture. What is an indenture? An indenture is a contract. Okay. In this example, we're talking about labor contracts where these impoverished English peasants would agree to work uh, for uh, for someone in the colonies for 4 to 6 years, and that's how they would pay for their travel expenses. Basically, the person that, like the landowner, for example, in, say, Virginia, would pay for the travel expenses of these peasants, and in return, those peasants would work for that landowner for 4 to 6 years, right? So they would agree to become indentured servants. Okay. Yeah, and the process of this, really quick, is first these peasants would sign the indenture with the ship captain that's going to, give them the ride. So the ship captain would be first the one to take on their travel costs, right? So yeah, you could ride on my ship. I'll bring you over to the Americas. Once they get to the Americas, then that ship captain would sell their contract, would sell their indenture to landowners, like for example in Virginia, and then of course he would hike up the price of it in order to pay for their travel expenses plus profit for him. And then the landowners would then own that indenture and that contract, and that's when these workers would agree to work for them for 4 to 6 years. Okay, so that's how the indentured servants and this massive peasant population get to North America, right? As indentured servants. Like 80% of immigrants who came to the Chesapeake area. The Chesapeake area is basically the area of like, Virginia, Maryland. 80% of those immigrants came as indentured servants. And in fact, there were not many African slaves, right? So African-based slavery was not really popular or widespread in the Chesapeake area in the early 1600s. It wasn't until the late 1600s, going into the 1700s, that you start to see an increase in the number of enslaved Africans in the region. So it's mostly indentured servants who are doing the majority of work at that time. And the indentured servants, their life and their lifestyle, their treatment was pretty much similar to the treatment of slaves, but not exactly the same because they were Englishmen and English women, and so eventually they would start to fight for their rights as English citizens or British citizens. So that's a difference. But yes, oftentimes indentured servants would be treated poorly. There would be punishments for petty crimes, like if they were caught stealing, for example, from the landowner. They would be punished, and usually the punishments were extending their contract, so they had to work more time. They had to put maybe another year or two onto their contract if they even for the slightest crimes. Why? Because of course the landowner wants to profit off of their labor. Okay, it's basically free labor. After the first year or so, the labor that the indentured servants did, it pretty much paid for those travel expenses that the landowner covered for them with the ship captain. Okay, so they're making a lot of profit off of these indentured servants. And it wasn't just men, women also came as indentured servants as well, and they had their own particular restrictions on their behavior. They could not get married, they could not have children while they were indentured servants. Why? Because the owner of their indenture, the landowner, felt that if a woman was married, then she would have to listen to what her husband tells her, and the landowner didn't want any competition in terms of control over this woman's life. And same thing with having children, even if it was out of wedlock, the woman would have to tend to those children and they wouldn't be able to work as much for the landowner. So if women, did get pregnant, and it did happen, of course, while they were indentured servants, they would be punished as well. And it could extend, it basically would extend their indenture, would extend the amount of time that they had to work for the landowner by years. Okay. So we said that some of the early colonies that the English attempted failed. Well, in 1607, we're going to have one of the first colonies that is going to eventually um, thrive, but it doesn't thrive at first. At first, it seems like it's going to fail too. What we're talking about is Jamestown. right? Jamestown in Virginia. And it started by the Virginia Company. Wonder why they called it Virginia, right? Okay. Uh, Going all the way back to royalty. Okay, so the Virginia Company is a joint stock company in England. Joint stock company is kind of like a corporation where you have various individuals buying stock in a company, and so they're like investors, and their money helps this company to function and to start off, and then they start selling their products and making a profit. Well, the Virginia company was a joint stock company, and they get a charter from the English government to start a colony in North America. And so they send over colonists to start this colony, and immediately, the first thing that the colonists do when they land is build a fort, right? Fortifications to protect themselves because they know that they don't belong there, and it's highly likely that they're going to be attacked, right? Because they're basically invading a foreign land and setting up a settlement there. And so they are attacked pretty early on by a local chiefdom by the name of the Powhatan. And so the Powhatan is a chiefdom, by the way. It's um, a political form where it's not just one tribe but multiple tribes under the control of one chief. And so the Powhatans were like that. They had a paramount chief whose name was Wahun Seneca. He's also known as Powhatan as well. And so the Powhatan had, involved several different tribes who were under the control of this one chief. And so the Powhatan confronted these first settlers in Jamestown, and this resulted in several skirmishes between the two. Not all out war, not like full on battles, but some fighting going on, between the two. They can't understand each other, but all they know is the Powhatan know is that these people are coming onto their land. They don't know why they're there, what their intentions are. Okay. And so the Virginia Company in those early years is not in good shape, I guess you could say. They're facing a lot of disease and starvation in those early years. And so why disease? Well, the area where they land, like Virginia, around Virginia and the Chesapeake area, it's pretty swampy. It's an area where salt water and fresh water are mixing together, and there's a lot of mosquitoes, and these mosquitoes carry malaria. And not just that, I mean, that could be deadly at the time. But not just that, a lot of the practices of these early settlers were not that sanitary. And so many of them often caught dysentery. They would pollute the local rivers, the waterways, and you had to use that water, for drinking and other things like that. So you're ingesting it, and so you end up getting sick, and if you get dysentery, you could get diarrhea, and then you basically get dehydrated and could die. And then there's also the issue of starvation. The early colonists that were coming to Jamestown or starting Jamestown, um, they were not really farmers. There's very few of them were farmers. Majority of them were upper class individuals who felt that manual labor was beneath them, which was a common viewpoint from the upper class in Europe at the time. They didn't like to do manual labor. They felt that there should be, servants beneath them who do that labor. If we, thinking back to the manorial system or feudal system with the lords and the peasantry. And that was the system that they knew. And so many of these upper class individuals, one didn't know how to farm and did not want to farm, refused to farm, even if it meant starvation. And so, what are they going to do, right? Is Jamestown going to fail? Well, almost, right? Many of them died from disease and starvation, but the Powhatan, who had, earlier had confrontations with the English, now come to trade with them. Okay, so natives to the rescue. All right. And so they're trading with them, bartering with them for corn. All right. So basically, you have the Powhatan who grow corn, right? They're an agricultural people. And so they have corn and they barter this, this is food, which the English need, they're starving. And so they barter for some of the goods that the English have. All right. And so this helps to save the colony of Jamestown in those early years when it was really struggling. And so the Virginia Company wants to entice more colonists to come to Jamestown so that it could grow and develop and develop an economy and have more workers. And so they started something called the headright system in 1618. Okay, so it's several years, a little over a decade after Jamestown starts. And with the headright system, for colonists who could afford to pay for their own travel expenses or the travel expenses of others, like indentured servants, for each person that you pay for their travel expenses, you would get 50 acres of land. So if I could pay for myself, right, my wife, my kids, indentured servants, for each one of us, I'm getting 50 acres of land, and all of a sudden, really quick, if I come from a wealthy family, really quick, I have myself a large plantation. Okay. And so you start to see eventually more and more wealthy individuals coming to Jamestown and establishing themselves pretty quickly with these large plantations. Let's talk about what they're growing in a little bit. Also, as you start to see the society of Jamestown develop, they also have a political structure there. Early democratic political structure, somewhat, semi-democratic political structure. And I'm talking about the House of Burgesses. Okay, the House of Burgesses. This is established in 1619. And what this is basically it's like a town assembly or a colonial assembly for the colony, an assembly where basically you have individuals who would be elected into the House of Burgesses, and these individuals could create law. They had legislative power. Okay. And so these individuals, you had to be a landowner in order to, vote and hold office in the House of Burgesses. Okay, so it was the landowners, it was the wealthy, the upper class. They were the ones that had political power in the House of Burgesses. But I said earlier, it was a semi-democratic society. So yeah, you have these elected individuals, right? But only the wealthy are electing them and getting elected to these positions. And also there were other limitations, such as the laws created by the House of Burgesses could be overruled by the Virginia Company because it's their colony, ultimately. And it's not just the House of Burgesses. That's not the only political body. There's also a governor there in Jamestown and later on the Virginia colony. And so this governor was not elected, so it's not democratic. In fact, this governor was appointed by the Virginia Company because it's their colony and they have control over it. Okay, so it's a semi-democratic structure. But very importantly, this sets a precedent for other later English colonies in North America over there in the East, in the East Coast, on the East Coast. So it sets a precedent for them, meaning that other English colonies would also eventually create these semi-democratic societies where they would have a colonial assembly like the House of Burgesses. Okay? And that's really important as later on when we start talking about the American Revolution, it ties into that because there's already a long history of democracy or a version of limited democracy in the English colonies. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about settler and native relations in Virginia. Earlier I was saying that, the Powhatan had bartered with corn for some of the English commodities, items, and there was some trade there. But Eventually, the Powhatan, they were used to only growing enough corn for themselves, right? It's not like they had, endless amounts of corn to trade with the English. They did have a lot of corn, but not endless amounts to trade with the English and supply them at Jamestown. And so when there were times when the Powhatan did not want to barter their corn for English items because they didn't have enough, at those times, the English would just take the corn by force, right? Go into Powhatan settlements or to their fields and just straight up steal their corn in order for their colonies to survive, right? And of course, that's going to lead to tensions between the Powhatan and the English. And there were other reasons why the Powhatan had concerns about this English settlement. Number one, as the Powhatan interacted with the English more frequently, they started to be exposed to diseases brought by the English, and this led to deadly epidemics and also led to a decrease in the Powhatan population. So, of course, that's a major concern for the Powhatan. Another big concern was labor for trade. So, now there's this big demand for Powhatan corn, and so Powhatan women who were responsible for growing corn and responsible for the agriculture, now there's more labor demands on them. They have to work more to grow more corn so that they can trade with the English. Okay. And remember, the English are not like some, extremely superior power to the Powhatan. They're outnumbered by the Powhatan at the time. It's not like they can, force the Powhatan to do this, but there is a demand there. And the Powhatan see that there is an advantage to getting some of these English items like guns and other, tools, metal tools and other items. So, they want to grow more corn in order to trade with the English. Okay. But that's a concern as well, because now the women have to work harder to grow more corn. And then lastly, another major concern is, by now the Powhatan are looking at the English colony, over a decade in, and they're like, wow, it looks like the English are not planning on leaving, right? Other European powers, including the English and the Portuguese and the French, had been trading with Native Americans since the 1500s along the East Coast of what is now the United States and Canada. And they were also fishing off the coast as well for hundreds of years. So it's not like the Powhatan didn't know about Europeans. But this is the first time that they're seeing a settlement, right? That's permanent and is not going anywhere. And of course, that is a major concern. Eventually, there would be warfare between the two. Several wars, the Powhatan-English Wars. And so earlier I talked about the Powhatan paramount chief by the name of Wahun Seneca. Um, well, eventually he would pass away in 1618, not too long after Jamestown was established, a little over a decade after that. And his brother would become the paramount chief of the Powhatan, Opechancanough. And under the leadership of Opechancanough, there would be a full-on war against the English. And so the first example of this is the uprising of 1622. Of course, there were other battles and skirmishes before this, but this is like the first major war. The uprising of 1622. So with this, you had the Powhatan under the leadership of Opechancanough. Uh, they came to Jamestown, right? And this wasn't an unusual thing, You know, periodically the Powhatan would go to Jamestown to trade or interact with the English, right? They didn't live with the English. Remember, the English like to live isolated from Native Americans for most of their colonies, or in most of their colonies. But anyhow, so the Powhatan come to Jamestown, and it seems like they're going to just, share a meal with the English, and they're like, spread throughout Jamestown. It's not like it's a huge settlement. And this is all part of a plan. And so when a signal is given, all of a sudden the Powhatan start attacking the English unexpectedly. English had no idea that this was coming. It's a surprise preemptive attack. And they end up killing over 300, almost 350 English settlers, which is about a third of the entire population of Jamestown at that time. So it's a major blow to Jamestown, but the English do survive. And you might be wondering, well, why didn't the Powhatan try to completely exterminate the English? Well, the Powhatan felt that this show of force would be enough to send a message to the English that it's time to leave. Maybe scare them off. But the English didn't leave. They refused to leave. And so instead, the English start launching counterattacks on Powhatan villages. And they're trying to exterminate the Powhatan, right? And so there's a bloody a series of bloody attacks on the Powhatan, for revenge, retaliation because of the uprising of 1622. Okay. But ultimately, Jamestown survives. And it's a major blow, though, to Jamestown. I mean, they lost a third of their population. And so they're going to have to import more colonists and more resources and supplies. It's going to cost a lot of money. And ultimately, it's too much for the Virginia Company. They're just suffering financial losses. And ultimately, the Virginia Company give up their charter. And so from that point on, after 1622, Virginia is no longer uh, a comp the it's no longer the colony of the Virginia Company. It then becomes a colony for the royal government. It becomes a royal colony. Okay, and so the British Crown actually takes control of the Virginia colony, Jamestown. Okay. So they're still there. They remain. And the Powhatan remain. Both forces are still there, but now there's major tension between the two. There's been death on both sides. Eventually, the Powhatan would attack again in 1644 with the Rebellion of 1644. And in this attack, again, the English would suffer massive casualties, even more than during the uprising of 1622. They lose about 500 colonists. Okay. But similar to the first situation, you have the English again surviving the attack, regrouping, and then going to attack the Powhatan in their villages. And so, it's another war. The Powhatan eventually suffer a lot of losses as well. And in the end, the English are able to force the Powhatan onto reservations, right? Arguably the first reservations in North America under English colonization. And so now the Powhatan signed treaties with the English saying that they will not leave these reservations or these certain areas. They're basically being restricted on what used to be their own land, right? Or still is their own land. But under these treaties, they have to stay on these reservations and can never come into the English settlements unless they're invited or allowed into that, unless they have permission to come to these English settlements, right? And so that's going to take a toll on the Powhatan, but again, they still remain, right? They're still there, they're still on their land, but they're on now smaller pieces of land, these reservations. Okay. And so eventually, throughout these early years of Jamestown and Virginia, where they were struggling, eventually they would find something that would help to bring more income for their colony and help their colony to thrive, and that would be tobacco. Tobacco becomes their gold. Okay, you know how the Spanish came to Central America and found gold and massive amounts of silver, and that helped to enrich them. That was how the Spanish became wealthy from their colonies, is mostly through mineral extraction in those early years. Well, for the English, they don't find a massive amount of gold or silver, but they're able to grow tobacco on tobacco plantations. Now we're talking about plantations where you're growing crops. Um, and they're able to grow enough tobacco and sell it back in England and other parts of Europe and make massive amounts of profit off of that. Okay. And so that would be how the English would eventually make the profit off of their North American colonies is through agriculture. And so if you're making profit off of agriculture, you need land, right? Which is going to prompt the British to try to expand more and more and gain more control over indigenous land. Okay. All right. Uh, Last thing we'll talk about today, we're still in the region of the Chesapeake, right? Mostly we're talking about Virginia. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the colony of Maryland, um, also in the Chesapeake region. Now, Maryland was established in 1632, so several decades after Jamestown and Virginia. And it was a colony where the charter was given not to a company, but instead to an individual by the name of Lord Baltimore, right? Cecilius Calvert is his actual name, but his title is Lord Baltimore. And Lord Baltimore, a wealthy a member of the English gentry, right? A landowner, a lord. And this individual was given this charter to start a colony in North America. And so he starts this colony, and his intention was to make a colony for Catholics, okay? Because there were still Catholics living in England, and of course other parts of the growing British Empire. And so for these Catholic individuals, they were often persecuted because the majority of the population was Protestant, right? And so he wanted to create a colony where Catholic individuals could come and pretty much they would dominate this colony, right? It's supposed to be a Catholic colony. And Protestants could live there too, but it was mostly people who were Catholic that had the power, the wealth, and the control, political power, in this colony. Okay. And so that was the original intention for Maryland. But the thing is, the people, the first colonists that came to Maryland, the majority of them were actually Protestant. They're from the Protestant lower class. They weren't Catholics, right? Because remember, there's a large population, right, in England that are looking for work, and the solution to the social crisis was migration and colonization, right? And so it's mostly Protestants, lower class Protestants who are coming to Maryland, right? And so they end up making up the majority of the population in the colony of Maryland, and Catholics would eventually come there as well, and the Catholics would hold the power, the political and economic power in Maryland for some time. Okay. Okay, so just a little bit on Maryland. All right, in this lecture, we covered early English colonization, and we talked about the colonies of Virginia and Maryland. And so we're going to go ahead and end off here. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and send me an email, and I will get back to you.